Good morning. Happy Monday. Thoughts from the car today. Today we're going to talk about the differences between vulnerabilities and weaknesses and how to leverage them for positive change. Over the weekend, I sent out my weekly newsletter, and this week I sent out my most vulnerable newsletter. And not going to lie, it was really scary. As a bold living coach, the way that I teach bold living is by doing. And it's scary sometimes. I've talked about it before about what bold living really is. It's doing things scared. And so I did that over the weekend. And it got me thinking this morning about the difference between the vulnerabilities and weaknesses. And there is a difference between the two. All right, so let's get into it. So like I said, there is a difference. It's a very subtle distinction. But vulnerability is really the susceptibility to harm or damage. Not necessarily that it's going to happen, but that there's an activity or a thought or being vulnerable in and of itself means that you are putting your place to be susceptible to harm, where you give someone the power necessarily to harm you if they wanted to. And the implication of this, though, is that it's a very natural state of being, and it's actually very much a part of being human, because every single one of us has vulnerabilities because we're human and because we're imperfect. So I don't want that to scare you from saying, well, I'm not going to be vulnerable because that puts me in harm's way. Here's the thing. Everybody puts themselves in harm's way. It's just either we can use it as a strength, or we can use it as something to be hidden and a limitation. And that's the difference. So vulnerability is the susceptibility of harm or damage, not meaning it actually will happen. Whereas a weakness is a lack of strength or the perceivedness of a limitation. That there is actually a limitation of some sort. And so vulnerability does not necessarily equate to weakness. Weaknesses are separate from vulnerabilities, because vulnerability it could be something, whereas a weakness is a lack of strength or perseverance or a lack of power, that is actually a limitation. Okay, so there is a difference. There's a slight, subtle difference there. Some examples of this would be vulnerabilities. Examples would be emotional vulnerability, would be sharing your feelings with someone, and then they could hurt you with those feelings. They could tell other people. That's being vulnerable, emotional vulnerability. A physical vulnerability could be being alone at night in a place you've never been before and you're unfamiliar with it. That could put you in It could possibly, it's not guaranteed, could put you in harm's way, but not necessarily guaranteed. Or financial vulnerability is having a limited income and then having an unexpected expense come up and you don't know how to pay it. So those are examples of vulnerabilities. Whereas examples of weaknesses, a physical example of weakness would be, if you have actual weakness in your body, you're not a strong person physically, it would be very difficult to carry heavy items. Mental weakness could be struggling with anxiety or depression. And this is a vulnerability. It is a weakness. It is a limitation on your mental state, and a limitation in your life. And then a moral weakness would be giving into something that's unethical or something that you don't necessarily want to do. And so you give into that, and it's a choice. That's a weakness. So why do we get these two mixed up so easily? Why do we get vulnerability and weaknesses mixed up? And I think there are some reasons. The first reason is both words and ideas of words tend to have negative connotations. And this is because of oftentimes there are feelings that are often associated with both of these phrases that leave us feeling inadequate or leave us feeling in fear. And this oftentimes will lead us to suppressing these feelings and that makes it difficult to distinguish between the two, because we try to suppress those negative feelings oftentimes of inadequacy and fear. And so we don't actually face them. And so we don't actually learn if the thing that we're afraid of or makes us feel inadequate, if that's a weakness of ours, or if it's actually a vulnerability. Because we're not testing it to see if it actually is a limitation or if it's just something that could be a vulnerability, that could put us susceptible to harm. Okay, so then there's also societal pressure. So with societal pressure, we put a high value on strength, and we put a high value in society on resiliency. And so this kind of leads us to feeling like if we feel vulnerable or we feel weak, that we have to hide it or disallow it or avoid it. We try to avoid weakness. We try to avoid vulnerability. Because society puts such a high value on being resilient and being strong and having confidence. And so we kind of put these other things in the category of lesser. And so we try to avoid them because of what society says. And then there's also just a lack of understanding. So when we have a lack of understanding of something, we just don't understand the subtle differences between a vulnerability and a weakness. And we use those words interchangeably. improperly. And so there really is a difference between having an actual weakness and a limitation in our life and having a vulnerability, because honestly, I feel like vulnerability is such a superpower. We'll get into that in a little bit, but it really can be such a superpower for us. And then there's also personal experiences that we have. So if we've personally experienced where we were vulnerable, for example, when we talked about emotional vulnerability, if we were emotionally vulnerable with someone and then someone used that against us, then we may see that as a weakness. Being emotionally vulnerable is a weakness, then we see it that way because of our personal experiences and how we have been hurt or certain setbacks that we've had. So then we see it that we don't see vulnerability as a strength. We don't see it as a superpower. We see it as something that's bad and something to be avoided in our personal experience. Okay, but here's the thing is that vulnerability really is a strength. It's a strength because the first reason is because of it creates empathy and connection. When we are vulnerable with others, this oftentimes allows other people and gives them permission to be vulnerable with us. And this promotes that deeper connection with others. And it allows others to see us and allows others to give themselves permission to be seen. And this is something that can be super helpful in building relationships and building intimacy. So we can actually use our vulnerability as an absolute superpower strength. Another reason is that being vulnerable builds resiliency. We've talked about this a little bit already. So when we overcome a challenge and in vulnerability, and then we talk to people about it, we share about this. This one builds resiliency. It also requires courage for us not only to overcome or to do the things to overcome whatever obstacle is in our way, but also to share that with others requires courage. It requires resiliency and perseverance because there are going to be people who are going to try to use that vulnerability against you. They're going to try to hurt you because they feel in competition and they want to one-up you. I think also being vulnerable builds is about personal growth. It helps us grow and it helps us become the person that we are to become. When we are vulnerable with others, it allows others to see our humanness. When we are vulnerable with others, it allows people to grow and see the vulnerabilities in us and see where there is potential for weaknesses. And then this requires us to overcome, and this requires us to actually grow and change our minds on certain things. I think it's also inspiration for others. And I kind of touched on this, when people see us being vulnerable, again, it inspires other people to then be vulnerable. And this in and of itself then creates supportive and compassionate communities. And it allows growth in a new way, not just individual growth, but then societal growth as well. So then how can we make our weaknesses our strengths as well? Because I think there's potential for this, for sure. I think the first thing is that we have to remember that our weaknesses can be strengths because it gives us a unique perspective. Wherever we are limited, we are going to give oftentimes empathy to someone else where they might also be limited in this area. So for example, if you are a very shy person, you're going to give more empathy to other people who are shy because can be a weakness in certain areas of society, in certain situations. So if you see someone else when you've been shy in a situation and you've needed empathy and this was a weakness of yours, you are going to give empathy to that person who is also shy in a similar situation. And so this again can then create that bond. It can create a community of people who are like-minded and create compassion. It's also great motivation for growth. Whenever you see something and you can recognize something as a weakness in your life, this could give you motivation for growth. It can make you want to set goals to overcome those weaknesses so that you are not weak in that area, because we want to change, we want to grow, and we want to become something new and different. The third thing I think that is that it does build resiliency in us. We touched on this already. When we have a weakness and we can recognize it as a weakness, this helps us persevere. And this allows us to change and grow and become something more or different. And this requires us to build resiliency. And it also requires us, the fourth thing I think is that it requires us to build new and develop new skills. When we see there's something that needs to change and we have that awareness of the weakness in our life, it helps us to develop new skills and increase. When we get new skills, this helps us increase our confidence because now we have something new tools that we can add to our tool belt to help us overcome in other areas of our life. And then I think the fifth thing that we can use our weaknesses for strengths is it helps create a sense of purpose in us. I think sometimes when we overcome challenges, it gives us that sense of accomplishment. So if we have a limitation in our life, and we overcome it, this is something that we can then share with others to help them to also possibly overcome as well. So what are some strategies? I think that it's really important for us to also understand that there are strategies and leverage that we can utilize our vulnerability and our weaknesses for positive change, not just in our own lives, but in everything around us, and the people around us, our communities, the environment we live in, just society in general. And I think to do this, how we leverage those things is the first thing is it gives us self-awareness. Our vulnerabilities and our weaknesses can make us really aware of ourselves. And it can be in a negative way, but it also really gives us acceptance. We can accept these things in ourselves oftentimes that are limitations in our life. They're not necessarily limiting beliefs. I mean, if we have a disability of some sort, it is a weakness, but we don't have to see it as a negative connotation. Like I said, it can be something that gives us a unique perspective, and it gives us a sense of purpose in our life to share those things. But it also gives us self-awareness. And when we can accept the vulnerabilities and some of the weaknesses in our life, this gives us then also a mirror, a reflection of some of the greatest strengths that we have as well. Because wherever there is a weakness or wherever we feel vulnerable, there's a counter strength that we then have as well. And I think this is really important to remember, that where we might feel weakness in some areas, there are other areas where we are very strong. And there are weak areas that we don't overcompensate in, but that we tend to lean into as our strengths. And then I think too, this helps us to set realistic goals for ourselves. When we are aware of vulnerabilities in our life or weaknesses that we have, we can set more realistic goals, not just for ourselves, but for whatever projects we're working on, or just in general, like being able to set more realistic goals for ourselves can then become a strength. We can use, again, that weakness or that vulnerability for our own strength by setting those realistic goals for ourselves. And then something that we can do too is to leverage those weaknesses that we have or those vulnerabilities is seeking support. Again, we can see some of these things as opportunities to grow. And so when we seek support, either from like a coach for external things that we're working on, or perhaps we have a lot of traumatic experiences in our life that have given us a lot of weaknesses, that we can talk to like a psychologist, a therapist, to help us overcome some of these things. We have the ability and we have a lot of opportunities for us to overcome things by seeking support. And I think we also learn from our failures. So oftentimes we leverage our weaknesses or our vulnerabilities by learning from them. So if we fail in an area, we don't have to just see it as failure. We can see it as an opportunity for growth. We can overcome and we can learn from them. And then the last two things, I've talked a lot about in the past, but having gratitude and compassion for ourselves. We can have gratitude for those areas where we are strong, have gratitude for those areas where we have overcome in our weakness or in our vulnerability. And I think too, this also is an opportunity for us to listen to God, to lean into that higher power, lean into the divine, because we don't have everything sorted out. We can't do everything on our own. So trusting God and having faith is something that we can have self-compassion for ourselves, for our weaknesses. And it also allows us to have gratitude for the opportunities and for the divine God, higher power, however you want to express that, for helping us through those different things. And then the last thing is we can use, again, our weaknesses and our vulnerabilities to help others, either in empathy and compassion, because they might be experiencing the same thing we have, but also just using our experiences to help others to learn. And also sometimes the things that we find as weaknesses or we might see as vulnerable actually do help other people. Like my newsletter that I sent over the weekend, I've already gotten a couple of messages from people saying how it really did help them just to see someone talk about the subject matter that I was talking about, and it made them feel less alone, and it made them feel like there was no reason to have guilt and shame over something that they had guilt and shame over that they shouldn't. The subject matter that I was talking about in my newsletter. So we can help others through our weaknesses. We can help others through our vulnerabilities. And that's a really cool superpower. All right. So I feel like I've really rambled a lot today. I haven't had any coffee, so I apologize if it's really rambly. Your challenge today is really try to identify maybe something that you see as a weakness in your life. Maybe try to figure out if it's really a weakness or if it's a vulnerability. And figure out where that source is, where you ask yourself where the source is of that feeling. Like, is the feeling of this being a weakness because of my experiences or because it was told to me? Or is this really just a vulnerability? And how can I use this then to my strength? How can I use this vulnerability to help others? How can I use this vulnerability as a superpower? All right, guys, have a fantastic Monday.